So, what we are covering today is one of the less interesting aspects of information security, certainly from someone's perspective, such as mine, who really enjoys focusing on the technical challenges, the pen testing, the malware analysis. Those are the things that I enjoy the most. There are people out there who really do enjoy risk analysis and coming up with mitigation strategies and all that. And it is a great career for those of you who enjoy that kind of paperwork. Um, and it is of critical import. If you can find yourself the necessary skills and get into that path in information security, your future is set. It's kind of the same thing as project management. If you have good technical skills and you can do project management and you enjoy doing that all the time, you can write your own future in information technology. It is more important now than ever, an understanding of all the different risks that are out there and how you can use existing technology and mitigate against it. It is of critical import. It really is. The content from today's lecture I got from a book called Management of Information Security by Whitman and Matford, written in 2004, and the content is still relevant today. The technologies that you use to manage this obviously change all the time. The threats change all the time. The underlying necessary skill sets, however, do not change, and they are as relevant today as they were a decade and a half, 2 decades ago. I first wrote this course about 13, 14 years ago, and that book was very relevant then, and I'm sure it's still relevant now. Okay. Um, Again, all of this is in the context of website development because, and I say this all the time to people, the moment you put something on the internet, you have to consider it compromised or at least compromisable. The moment you open up any service to web traffic, boom, you are under attack. Full stop. I'm not saying all attacks are going to be successful. I'm not even saying all attacks are manual. Some of them are just part of the automated string of attacks that are ongoing all the time for all web traffic. Again, I've mentioned this website before, userfriendly.org. I like his sense of humor. What we're going to talk about today, however, better falls under this very famous quote from Sun Tzu, which basically says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Understanding what's going on in the wild, showing you the kinds of pen tests that you will see when you get out into the wild, that helps you know the enemy, but you have to know yourself. Knowing your enemy is great, and once you know that, brilliant. You can move forward with preventing those kinds of attack against you. But unless you know yourself, unless you've done a detailed analysis of the assets that you have and understand those threats, those risks against those assets, you are not going to be successful in mitigating those threats against those assets that you have. All right. Once you know your own weakness, you can start focusing on the risks, examining the threats, understanding how those threats and risks culminate against an overall security risk rating, and this is going to be a little bit out of scope for this class, but determining how to control or mitigate risks and threats. Once you go through that process, it's known as risk management or a risk management program. Okay, you develop a policy document, which is like every other document you develop. You don't just set it on a shelf and call it done. We talked about this when we talked about privacy. Once you have a policy in place, you need to revisit it on an ongoing basis, and it is especially important for risk management. And we could not have asked for a better example than the lives we are living right now. Imagine if you wrote a risk management document in late 2019. If you were to revisit that document today, the threats and the assets would be fundamentally different. Assets now include home users and home user networks and home technology, and the very real possibility Those would be the assets, and some of the new risks, they're going to be quite likely outside of your protected bubble of filters, making sure that, all of those techniques that you put in place to protect your clients, your employees, or maybe even your customers inside your infrastructure. It's very difficult to extend that bubble out to individual home networks. Also, kids are going to be kids. If they see mom or dad has a really nice computer, they're going to try and get on it and play games, right? So the risks are fundamentally different. So it's great to develop one of these things, but you have to revisit it on a regular scheduled basis. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Any questions? Does that make sense? Let's move on. All systems are vulnerable, not only from outside threats, but from inside threats as well. And you need to identify those internal threats. We've said this many times. The technical mitigations that we have in place to protect our systems are great these days. They're very, very good systems. The one continued weakness that we see in this world is the end user. You can mitigate these risks by understanding how the data is processed, stored, and transmitted in your application stack. Where does it go to? Where is it stored? Does it ever leave the building? Do your users use thumb drives? Do they have, the ability to work on this stuff remotely? What does that mean, especially these days? Understanding how all of that works together is critically important. And as I just finished explaining in excruciating detail, these things must be maintained and kept current, and it should involve three main groups. Ideally, you're in an organization that has not only an information security group, or not only an information technology group, I should say, but a separate group focused purely on information security. You want to involve the information technology group, and of course, as always, you want to involve management and end users, because, as we've said before, it's the best way of getting end user involvement is by involving them in the process. This is the overall process for identifying risk, and it's very, it's almost obvious at this point, but it's good to identify them. You want to, like any project, plan and organize a process, but you want to very early on start identifying component categories. You don't want to just start listing assets like database. All right? You don't want to just list assets like a switch. You want to identify categories so you can focus on individual categories of assets early on. So database might be a thing, but database might also be a category, so you can start having specific databases. Switches are important to identify as assets that might be vulnerable to threats, but they would fit under a general asset category such as networks or network components. So create component categories and then start developing assets that fall under those individual component categories. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on component categories, but we will start identifying assets very early on. Once you've got a list of assets, identify threats, specify vulnerable assets related to those threats, and you're going to try and assign a value or impact rating to an asset, and then a likelihood that a threat is going to compromise that asset. We're going to use that to calculate a relative risk factor, and that's really what the goal is of this week's lectures. Coming up with a relative risk factor for assets that might be subject to a specific threat. I've got an email server. There are tons of threats against email servers. Let's identify them so we can prioritize addressing these kinds of threats. Because if you try and fix everything all the time, something is going to get through. If something is going to get through, you want to have it have a lower risk factor than something that has a higher risk factor for obvious reasons. Any questions on that? Alrighty, let's move on. When you're inventorying your assets, consider everything. Consider even the weird stuff. People inside and the outside of the organization. Are your suppliers assets? Probably yeah. Are your customers assets? Probably yeah. What kind of risks are against them from a security point of view? Do you need to include that in your risk management policy document? Take a look at procedures, standard procedures and sensitive ones, those that can introduce risk. Where is your data? We've talked about that. What software do you use? What hardware does that software run on? And, of course, networks. We don't spend a lot of time focusing on network attacks here, but networks are often the focus of attacks, so it's really important to identify those in your overall risk management plan. Once an asset has been identified, you need to develop, this slide's a little bit more than what we're going to talk about, but what you really need to do, what this slide is saying is, once you start identifying your assets, you need to do an initial classification of the value of that asset. We're not actually assigning a value, but we're trying to figure out how important it is to the organization. And this initial inventory, this initial assessment can include things such as, is it expensive or is it cheap to replace? Is it is it really high secret or highly secretive information, or is it public information? So we're doing an initial look at these assets so we can use that information to actually assign a value at some point, which is, of course, the next step. As these assets have been identified and categorized, they need to have some relative valuation. And this is where things get a little tricky. How do you compare the relative values of a network switch and a database? Like, how do you say a network switch is worth 3 where a database is worth 10, right? I mean, you can understand it on a scale of 1 to 10. A switch is important. Maybe it's a 4, maybe it's a 5, but the database and the data inside of it are critically important. How do you come up with those valuations? We're going to look at that today. And it is organizational specific. I'm going to give you some categories, I'm going to give you some formulas today that'll get you through the process, but please understand that you can't just take the spreadsheet and use it without serious review and making the formulas and the categories organizational specific. They have to be, because every organization is going to be different. All right? But these valuations can be based on, the critical success of the organization, or generates the most revenue, or generates the highest profitability. Those can be two different, and they're related, but not exactly the same thing. Expensive to replace, expensive to protect, or what's going to happen if this compromise gets out? What's that going to do to your reputation? We already talked about that website. Somebody help me here. The site that encouraged people to be unfaithful. Anybody? We talked about it with privacy. Oh, what was that site called? The name escapes me. But when their data was compromised, that's the one. Ashley Madison. Thank you very much. That's exactly the site I was talking about. When their information was compromised, it was damaging. It hurt a lot of people. Some people committed suicide, but part of the information that was compromised was their entire business model was based on somebody in the organization responding to these requests from mostly men, like vast majority were men, and you're not even sure that you were talking to a bot, or B, some internal employee just working off of a skit. I can remember back in the early days of downloading drivers from the internet, I was going to the ATI website to try and find drivers for some video card. And I went to ati.com or whatever it was, and on the home page of the ATI website was a steaming coil of poo. No exaggeration. Somebody had hacked their website and uploaded, at the time I thought it was funny graphic. I guess they were editorializing on the quality of ATI products. I never really agreed with that. I always liked ATI. But that was their website for at least one day back in the 90s, which is horribly embarrassing. 90s or early 2000s. I can't remember exactly when. So that is going to be embarrassing for anybody. Your classification needs to fit your organization. As I said, these are very organizational specific. You can consider, like, I always fall back to my military experience when it comes to security, like top secret, secret, protected, what have you. But that's just me. That doesn't make it wrong, but you need to have something that you can use to assign values to individual components. I give you an example here. And this is a good time to take a look at the content in Learn if you haven't already done so. In Learn, this This shell is quite large. There's like 47 files in it, and I know that's daunting and I apologize, but there's a reason for this. The main topic area is, well, what is that? 11 files, right? Really, which is not that big. But then I've got a bunch of surveys, and I include these just for historical purposes for your information. I also have a bunch of mind maps. And if you've never done a mind mapping activity, we're going to do one in our next class together. I think I have you tomorrow for 2 hours. We're going to do a mind mapping activity in tomorrow's class for a couple hours just so you can go through and understand the process. It'll help us identify assets and threats, and we will map it all out, and then you can use that for an assignment. There is an assignment related to this topic. You can also use the information in the surveys in this as well. But up in the main topic area for this module, I've got a couple of spreadsheets. One is called Security Risk Management Tables, which a lot of these examples are taken from, which this was taken directly from that book I referenced on slide 1. And I've also got a sample one, which also appears in the assignment. And this more closely represents what I'm hoping you will do for today's assignment, for this week's assignment. Okay? So when we take a look at these spreadsheets, I don't even know if they're still available. So busy. So busy. Never tell anybody that you're really happy with your job. They tend to give you more work. It's something I learned time and time again, and yet I continually fail to remember. All right. When you take a look at the Security Risk Management Table, okay, it's not just Teams, it's everything. This spreadsheet that I've uploaded is basically the template that I used for this conversation, and it talks about the different kinds of information we want. We identify some assets, and then we start assigning values for those assets. And that's what we are now. The next tab is actually taking those assets, identifying risks or vulnerabilities, and the likelihood. And all of these are based on some very simple math, some very simple Excel formulas that allow us to start figuring out a relative value and a relative risk value for our assets. And in the case of the risk value, the threats and assets together. Okay? So let's take a look at this spreadsheet together, if you will. First off, what does EDI stand for? And what does BOL stand for? Does anybody know? No? Those are very old terms, and that's why that's right. Yes, and BOL's exactly. And that's why we include a notes section, because if you use acronyms, and acronyms are fine in policy documents and in policy worksheets, as long as you define what they are. All right. And the nice thing about using acronyms is that it brings the end user into your language, and again, they have a greater sense of belonging in the process and are more likely to champion that product at the end of the rollout. So it's okay to use acronyms as long as you define them. Back in the day, before we had XML and JSON files for moving data between browsers or web servers or what have you, we had the electronic data interchange, which was a manner for supply chain types to supply data back and forth between computer systems. Those, of course, have been by and large replaced with XML, or if you really understand the data schema that you're using, JSON notation, of course. So it's old, but still, I keep it in there to show you that if you are going to use acronyms, define those acronyms in your documentation. A bill of lading, those are probably still relevant today, but those are just kind of the information that goes into one person's accounting system from another accounting system. But identify them, right? We've got these logistical documents moving around. They are clearly assets that are important to our business. Well, how important? They're very private, and they are very high or critical to my overall profitability. These categories here you need to define as part of your workflow process. Once you've started assigning some relative categories of importance, you can then take these assets and move them into the asset weighted factor tab. And then you need to come up with criteria. I've come up with 3. You need to have as many criteria as you want. And then you break up those criteria into different values. In my case, what I'm trying to say on this sheet is that I have 3 criteria. Impact on revenue, impact on profitability, and impact on my public image. I think revenue and public image are important, but I think profitability is a little bit more important. So for me, I have this breakdown of 30, 40, 30. It nicely adds up to 100. It doesn't have to. It's up to you. Okay? You can use my numbers, but in the real world, you would make these weighted criteria and these specific criteria ranges specific to your organization. Making them add up to 100 is a nice easy way, nice round number, and that's great. So now that I've done that, I can say this asset here has this much impact on revenue, this much impact on profitability, and this much impact on my image. It's important to revenue, it's really important to profitability, it's important to my public image. And then I have a range. In this case, I have a range from 0 to 1. It's unlikely you're going to have a 0. It's possible. It's possible you have an asset that has absolutely no impact on one of those criteria, but it should be low. I'm getting flashes that the network connectivity is weak. Am I breaking up when I'm talking to you guys? Really? I just got MTS last night to set me up in my new apartment, and of course MTS is going to mess up. Slow for you as well, Nicholas? Yeah. You're not even loading. Okay, well, okay, trust me on this. I am recording this, and I'll make this video available for you very soon. I apologize for the technical glitches. We'll try and fix those very soon. I am going to have to wrap this meeting up early, though, because I'm going to have to change my setup so that I'm closer to better internet connectivity. I didn't think I was going to have to do that, but okay, whatever. Okay, so just have the spreadsheet open. The spreadsheet, if you can download the spreadsheet that you have available in Learn, the spreadsheet I have open is the security risk management tables, not the sample one, just the security risk management tables spreadsheet. And I'm on tab 2, example weight factor. Each of these individual categories are, each of these individual values are a relative valuation for this asset based on this criteria. So as I was saying, the impact on revenue, my outbound EDIs are pretty important, not as important as profitability, but pretty important. So I'm going to give them a 0.8 and a 0.9. Public image is meh, so 50%. I'm going to give it a 0.5. You can use whatever ranges you want. You just need to be as consistent as possible. For example, customer orders, incredibly important to revenue, incredibly important to profitability, and because these are our customers, it's incredibly important to my public image. So there's no decimal values. It's 111, giving me a value of 100. And now I've got all of these very different assets having a relative weighted score. Any questions on that? Let's move on. Once you've identified these assets, you can then start assigning a relative valuation, or an order of importance is what we're calling it here. But basically you need to have some way of identifying the value of an asset so you can determine its value if you lose it, its value if, like we said earlier, what much required to replace it, those kinds of concerns. You could use a range of 1 to 100. You can use whatever ranges you want. I have identified some ranges here, and then for each one of those, you assign a relative impact, I should say, a relative value to the relative overall criteria weight, and then that's what I wanted to show you. You then just use a simple formula. When I double click on this formula, you can see it's this times this plus this times this plus this times this. You can't really see that, so let's make that column just a little bit wider. It's the criteria value times what this specific asset is, plus this criteria value times this specific value, plus this times this. And all together, that's going to give me this weighted score right here. Any questions on that? Okay, let's move on. Now you need to identify threats to your assets. If you assume every threat is a threat to every asset, your project is just going to spiral out of control. It's great to identify the main threats, and then in a future iteration start identifying other threats that you may not have thought were important or that may have emerged in industry, ones that were murmurs of in the past that are now real threats. You need to go through and identify those threats and prioritize their impact on that asset. There are different categories of threats. There are human, which is more often than not the biggest threat. There's compromises to your IP. There's deliberate acts of espionage or trespass or information extortion or acts of sabotage and vandalism or just simple theft. Software attacks. Forces of nature. Do we think we have to worry about forces of nature here in Manitoba? Anybody? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Last fall. Yeah, not this fall, but yep. Only place in Canada for an F5 tornado was in Manitoba. Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. Yeah, we have huge issues. Wow. Yeah, well, if we start down that path, I will not get this lecture done. So, yeah, but you're right. All of these things are huge impacts. Now, when you talk about things like earthquakes, do we have issues with earthquakes in Manitoba? Well, no, but, and this has been largely disproved and discounted. Pardon? I didn't hear that. Kiki, say again? Yeah, that's something I hadn't even considered was fracking, but what I was thinking about was there was this talk about the super volcano in Yellowstone Park. Now, it's been mostly discredited. Yeah, it's close enough that if that super volcano does explode, we're going to feel it here, and we don't really have the infrastructure for earthquake protection in Manitoba. Now, again, it's been mostly discredited, but it's something you have to be aware of when you're doing these kinds of risk documents. I'm not meaning to scare you guys. I'm saying, again, stick your heads up above your computer monitors and see what's going on. Go ahead, Kiki. Yep, I do. I agree with you 100%. You do need to take a look. You need to take a long look at a lot of these things, but it does need to be limited in scope. And I will say something that supports your more globalistic view. There's a trend, a tendency to go more and more globalizing. These super organizations buying up everything on the planet just so they can have their fingers in everything. You start taking a look at risks there, and then there is no bubble. There is no delineation. It does become a global concern. So yeah, it's valid. I consider it to be completely valid to consider these things in a global context. Just so you know, I am recording this, but I am not recording your feedback because I don't want to go and get everybody's explicit permission to capture. So when you listen to this video later, there might be gaps where people are talking and your voice is not getting captured, and that's by design. Okay? Another type is you bring, like I was just saying, you have these global mergers happening, and you bring in these companies, and they need to, dovetail your technology with their technology, and you can't always guarantee that the new code you're getting into your organization is as good as the code you already have in place. So that also introduces some threats. There's always the technical issues around hardware and software, and of course, obsolescence. There is, I hope none of you come across this in your careers, but there's always that chance that you still see it today. You go into one of these big chain places, you ask them a question, and they fire up a terminal, and they open up an old Unix terminal thing, and they're doing inventory checking on some archaic mainframe running somewhere in the world because they're still using it because nobody wants to get rid of it. The problem is nobody wants to touch that software because they're afraid of breaking it, and that introduces huge risk into your organization. And that might actually fall under the category of just accepting the risk. We don't like that we have it. We don't like that we continue to use it. There's all kinds of risk. The act of fixing it introduces more risk. We just have to accept that risk in our documentation. Any questions on any of that? Let's move on. How do you assign the likelihood of a threat against an asset? There's a couple of different ways of doing it. One of the easier ways of doing it is by bringing your own experiences into the room. You can augment that, however, with different trend analysis of different threats. This slide here makes reference to something that disappeared a while ago, which is really unfortunate because it used to be a great thing. The CSI Institute used to do this annual reach out to CTOs and CFOs and CIOs and CSOs, like the senior information technology people, and the C-suites types. I'm just sorry, I'm losing my language today because of course I'm recording this. But the C-suite types of executives that are responsible for information technology and information security, they would do a survey of these people on a regular basis and have them identify the greatest threats against their organizations. And they would roll it up into these great surveys, and they stopped producing them, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other ones out there for you to take a look at. Again, when you take a look in the Learn shell for today's class, I have all of these different surveys, including one from last year, which when we take a look at, you can use this to start assigning some valuation on the level and the likelihood of a threat against your organization. Kiki, did you have something you wanted to say? Your mic is hot. Oh, okay. That's okay. No, it's okay. No. If you want to say, let me know. I want to hear. If people want to talk, I always want to hear. But these surveys that you can use, they could talk about the likelihood of threats, and then you can use that to assign a valuation when you're taking a look at the next slide, which is ranking different types of threats or vulnerabilities against the assets. So we start looking at different types of risks, and as I was saying, you can use all kinds of tools out there, but it's critically important to use your own experiences because, again, every organization is different, and they're going to see and experience threats that are different, and they're going to see and experience those threats differently than other organizations. So you take your asset and its value, you bring it over to the ranked vulnerability, the asset. I've only got two assets here, and their valuations, and you can see we've got two very different values of assets. Email was a lower valued asset. The customer orders was a very high valued asset. But when we start looking at risks against those assets and the likelihood that those risks are going to occur, we just do a simple just a simple multiplication, and very quickly you find out that even though email is a lower valued asset, it is a higher risked asset because of the types of threats and the likelihood of those threats. And that's where things get really, really, really important. One of the most important assets in the organization can have some very real world threats, but these threats are so unlikely that the risk factor, the relative risk factor, is very, very low. Okay? When it comes to setting the likelihood of one of these attacks, you should never have a zero likelihood. If you list a vulnerability or a threat and you say the likelihood is zero, get it out of your worksheets. You don't need to identify things with zero threats. The very low ones, okay, that's fine. Include those, and you don't need to address those round one of risk mitigation. But you need to identify them so that you have a relative risk factor, so that you can at least say this is something we should take a look at, if not now, sometime in the future. And then of course, once you've done that, you can start rolling out some mitigations. Those are out of scope for the lecture right now, but that's what the fourth tab is. I include that because that was in the original examples I got from that book. I really liked that, so I've included it in the worksheet. All right, so identify assets, give them some general categories, take those general categories, come up with criteria and relative valuation in those criteria so you can come up with a relative weighted score to identify a value for that asset. Once you've done that, take those assets and their values, identify some threats and the likelihood that those threats are going to occur to give you a relative risk factor rating. Any questions on that? That is the assignment going forward. Okay? Coming up with a list of assets and then coming up with a relative risk factor. Okay? Once your asset has been identified and valued, you start identifying vulnerabilities or risks against that, and then you itemize them, and more importantly, you identify a likelihood that that is going to occur. And once you have a likelihood of a threat occurring against an asset, you've got a relative risk value. The formulas I use are pretty simple because I didn't want to get into mitigation controls, and I certainly didn't want to add an uncertainty value. It seems weird to me. So one thing I push back on this example is adding an uncertainty variable. How do you assign a value to an uncertainty variable? You know, that seems just going to add something to your formulas that is going to invalidate the process. So I leave that out of the conversations. But if you've got mitigation controls in place against some of these threats, you can maybe add that to your formula as well. I don't, in my example, I don't expect you to, because the scenario that I present to you doesn't have any mitigations in place right now. So, but keep that in mind again going forward. You may have an asset, you may have a threat. If your threat likelihood doesn't include the mitigations, then you can add that as a new element into your formula. Okay? Any questions on that? Let's move on. This is assuming, of course, you're all still there and haven't been kicked out because of, Microsoft. So, the likelihood of a threat should never be... Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Awesome. The likelihood of something, you can again use whatever scale you want. I used from almost 0 up to 1. Something should never be 0, so you can get down to the tens or hundreds of a value, tenths or hundredths of a value, but you should never have a risk set to 0. If you've identified a threat, then you really need to identify the likelihood that that threat is going to occur. 1 second, please. Excuse me. Sorry about that. If it does end up that the threat is 0, then why are you identifying it as a risk to that asset? So I wouldn't worry too much about it. You can use some of the surveys I've given you, but use your experience. And again, it's one of those group decisions. and try to be as consistent as possible. Okay. You can add the mitigations if you want. That's always valuable. You can add an uncertainty variable. I tend to think that that's just introducing an invaluable and frankly invalid variable into the equation, in my opinion. But maybe you can figure out a way of doing that. So when you start doing that, you get some interesting values. For example, when we run these numbers through our spreadsheet, very quickly we realize that the least valuable asset with a more likely threat is at a higher risk rating than the most valuable asset with a very serious threat but a low likelihood of occurring. Their relative valuations end up being much less. Now, if you don't agree, if you run these numbers and you say, this is saying we don't have to worry about a distributed denial of service attack, I don't accept that, well then change your numbers so that the values make sense. If you run these numbers and you're unhappy, you think that this is far too low of a relative risk ratings, then you need to revisit either the value or the likelihood of a threat. And that is acceptable, all right? If you run the numbers, you're not happy with the results, revisit some of the numbers to change those results. Any questions on that? No, I went too far, sorry. As with any policy, you don't just write this thing and set it on a shelf. You need to follow it up, and part of the project needs to be an annual review. I wouldn't go more than a year without reviewing this. Maybe you review it every 6 months, maybe more frequently. Maybe you have a policy that allows this to be responded to much more quickly if something significant changes, like we have right now with the response to the COVID threat. Once you're done, though, you've got a summarized worksheet that allows you to start implementing risk control strategies. And there's a couple of different ways of doing this. I've missed a slide. Oh, there it is. It's coming up. So you can do a couple of different things. You can do policies that avoid whatever that risk might be. You might actually just simply transfer that risk to other areas or outside of the organization. I've said this before. Capturing credit card information is a very expensive and risky process for small organizations. Don't. Outsource that responsibility. PayPal has all of the controls and mitigations in place. They cost, but you can outsource that responsibility to PayPal. If you don't like PayPal, and a lot of people don't, it's always good to have a secondary payment acceptance tool. There's a company in Toronto called eRegister Now that will do payment gateways for you, so you can simply plug it into whatever web application you're building. And that's transference. You can put mitigation controls in place, of course. Did someone have a question? Kiki, your mic is hot. Did you have something? You're breaking up, Kiki. Yes? Okay, type it in the chat area if you can, and then we can talk about it. But please, I don't want to... Yeah, okay, thank you. So, simply putting in mitigations in place, like there's always the threat for phishing. So, put some filters in your email system to mitigate against that threat. And then finally, as I was saying with the old mainframe application running somewhere, some risk you just have to accept without trying to put any controls in place, because the controls may actually do more damage. You can put firewalls around it, you can put network protection, but if you can't actually change that application to mitigate that risk, then at certain points you just have to accept that. There's always workflow or program flow with any of these things. You could take a look at that. And then once you've started taking a look at putting some controls in place to address this, there are different types of controls. Again, this is really out of scope for what we're trying to cover. You can do some control functions. You can use some architectural stuff where you insert new layers into the process to mitigate against problems. You can use some strategic things, as we talked about, avoidance, mitigation, or transference. And then you can use some of the standard information security principles, such as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The CIA triangle is often used, and I wish I had it in this slide. I don't know why I don't. But the CIA triangle of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, those are often viewed as the main ways of ensuring your systems, or of explaining why your systems and how your systems need to be available all the time. You protect the data, you ensure that it is correct, and you ensure that it is available. They're equal parts of an equilateral triangle, and very standard way of looking at some of the ways of ensuring that you have proper security protection principles in place. You can also use authentication and authorization. We'll take a look at this towards the end of this course, where you verify that you are who you say you are, and then you are verified to do certain things within an organization. Ensuring, as we saw when we were talking about privacy, that you don't go outside of that. You can also introduce accountability. So if somebody is doing something inappropriate, those activities can be traced back to the individual user. And of course, as we talked about earlier, privacy, privacy, privacy. Any questions on any of that? Okay. This is not a revenue-making workflow. This is going to be an expense, and it's going to be difficult. Back in the day, it was very difficult to get organizations to buy into this workflow process. Very, very difficult, because organizations would just look at this as a simple expense item and not a revenue-making item. Fortunately, in recent years, that has changed, so it is much easier to convince organizations that you should do this, but they're going to push back. So one of the ways you can justify the expense is a cost-benefit analysis. Not where you're making revenue, but where you're avoiding expenses in the future. And we have a lot of examples of where organizations have failed to protect their infrastructure, protect their information, and has cost them significantly. You can use those as a justification for your policy and the amount of work that you have to do. This is an open style. It's not very structured. It's just taking some information from a book and creating a spreadsheet so you can have a building plan around it. But there are other more formalized processes out there. One of them, a very popular one, is the Operational and Critical Threat Asset and Vulnerability Evaluation Method, or OCTAVE. If you want, you can take a look at it, and when you look at it, you realize it's very similar to what we were talking about today. There's three main phases. You build an asset-based threat profile where you identify a bunch of assets. You identify vulnerabilities against those assets. You evaluate them, and then the third phase is, of course, developing a strategic plan around a strategy and a plan around protecting those assets. Any questions? Does that make sense? What are gerbs? Oh, thanks. Yeah, making jobs. Yes. Okay. Yeah. You guys, you kids in your new language, I tells you, back in my days, we didn't talk like that. I know. I'm very old, but I understand what you're trying to say, Kiki. So, there is an assignment associated with this work. You can start taking a look at that assignment right now. It is in the Dropbox, but basically, it involves around... Wow, is it slow? I wonder if it's my new internet is just too frickin' slow. It's really around the sample sheet that I have given you a link to. Now, don't just resubmit this to me, please. But this is the what I'm hoping you will get to by the end of the assignment, where you've got basically the three tabs. You can include the fourth tab, you can leave it there, it's up to you. But there's a scenario. You have this company, doesn't matter what they're called, and they're selling widgets. And widgets is just a placeholder for whatever product that this organization is selling. They want to move it on to that interweb. This is the notion is that it's a very old school company. They build their stuff. They're left alone in their little corner of the world, and they've never stuck their head out. But now they realize that they can sell their widgets on this new eBay site that's out there, where they might be able to make some more money rather than selling to distributors who then turn around and sell it to customers. They want to try and sell directly to the market by using something like eBay or something like that. So they don't know what they want, but they know they want to leverage the internet to try and make a little bit more revenue. So they've asked you to take a look at a number of different scenarios. A hosted solution where you just deploy your application to somebody who sells hosting services such as SWD here in Winnipeg. They have an in-house solution where they bring everything in-house. The credit card payments, the database, the web application, everything is in-house on their own hardware. Or the third option is a third-party solution where they use something like Shopify. They just populate an existing application on the cloud. PayPal also has a shopping cart feature, something like that. So your job is to do an initial risk assessment. Identify some assets, give them some general classifications. I know my internet's dropping again, I apologize. Figure out relative valuations for those different assets, and then come up with some threats and relative risks factors for those threats. I want, for each scenario, I want at least 5 assets, different assets for each scenario. Once you have that, each of those assets should have separate weighted scores. Once you have the assets and the weighted scores for each of those 3 scenarios, you should then come up with at least 3 threats for each of those assets. At the end of the day, you're going to have 5 assets for each scenario. It's going to give you 15 assets. Each asset is going to have 3 threats. You're going to have a total of 45 asset threat combinations, 45 individual risk items that you can then take a look at and see what the relative risks are going to be. That's the assignment. Outside of doing our mind mapping activity in our next class together, that's what I want you to focus on. Okay, you can start it now, but really I would like you to wait until we do the mind mapping activity in our next class together. But you can start looking at this, and in preparation for our next class, I would also like you to take a look at some of the mind maps that I have produced in the past, just so you know what you're getting yourselves into. If you've never done a mind mapping activity, well, that didn't work at all. If you've never done a mind mapping activity, here's some examples of mind maps. I've got the Visio files. If you have Visio, you can take a look at the Visio files, but each one of these Visio files has a PDF that you can look at as well. If you don't have Visio, it's not a problem. I'm actually going to show you how to use something other than Visio in tomorrow's class. Okay, so take a look at the mind maps. Take a look and make sure you understand what I'm looking for in the assignment. Maybe take a look at the survey so you understand some of the risks. And in tomorrow's class, we're actually going to do a mind mapping activity where we lay out assets and threats together. Any questions? I'm going to stop the recording now.